Yosemite National Park, California. Labor Day, 1989. Late summer sunlight spilled across the green lawn at Curry Village, rows of picnic tables, packed with families, the air thick with charcoal smoke and sunscreen. On the grass, 5 children from the Anderson and Miller families darted between the tall pines, their laughter carried on the wind. Martha Anderson leaned against a table, her eyes following her daughter Megan out in front, her blonde hair catching the light. A moment later, the kids veered toward the edge of the woods, disappearing into the trees. "Don't go too far," Martha called after them, but her voice was swallowed by the rustling leaves. Minutes later, the forest was quiet again. On the grass, a small red tricycle stood alone by the dirt path, its paint faded and dusty. And from that moment on, no one saw the children return. On the final afternoon of Labor Day weekend, Yosemite Valley glowed under the late summer sun, spilling soft, golden light across the Curry Village picnic grounds. The scene was as ordinary as any summer, before wooden tables crowded with food meat, sizzling over charcoal cups of soda, sweating in the heat. Children darted across the grass, their laughter weaving into the gentle rustle of pine branches above. The Anderson and Miller families had set up their blankets near the edge of the woods, where the shade was deeper and the air cooler. Martha Anderson straightened the tablecloth, glancing every now and then toward the children as they raced in circles. The 5 of them moved like a flock of birds, kicking up faint trails of dust as they went. Megan led the pack, her blonde hair tangled in the breeze, followed by Jason clutching a scuffed tennis ball and the 3 Miller siblings with dirt on their hands and grass stains on their knees. In a blink, they veered off toward the trees, their shapes fading between the trunks, then disappearing entirely. Martha paused, squinting at the line of trees. No sign of them now, only branches swaying lazily in the wind. Jason's red tricycle still stood crooked near the trailhead, its paint faded, a few flecks of rust crawling up the front wheel. A strange hush seemed to settle over the lawn, swallowing the noise from moments before. Daniel Anderson abandoned the grill, wiping his hands on his jeans as he stepped toward the woods. Minutes later, he came back pale-faced, his eyes wide with a quiet kind of panic. There were no footprints, no voices, not even the crack of a twig. In an instant, Yosemite fell silent in a way that felt unnatural, as though the children had never been there at all. A few napkins blew across the table and caught in the dirt. On a damp rock near the old stone well, Megan's pink digital watch lay face down, its cracked screen flashing faintly 3:17 p.m. 17. Then even that light went dark. As the sun sank behind the granite peaks, the trail into the woods deepened into shadow, and everything about the Anderson-Miller children seemed to vanish with the daylight. Only the crooked tricycle and the dead watch remained. The grass whispered in the breeze as though reminding the living that Yosemite had swallowed them whole, and no one truly saw them return. 36 years later, Yosemite Valley was almost unrecognizable. Curry Village still existed, but the grassy field where the Anderson and Miller families once laid out their picnic was nothing more than a patch of rotting benches and cold fire rings buried under layers of pine needles. That edge of the woods had been closed for years, cordoned off by a sagging chain and a faded sign swinging in the wind, closed for restoration. No one camped there anymore. People avoided it, as if carrying a quiet superstition. On a late August morning, a black SUV pulled into the narrow lot at the end of the road. Trevor Collins, a YouTube filmmaker, stepped out, clutching his drone controller and tripod. He'd filmed dozens of abandoned places across California, from ghost towns to collapsing amusement parks. But Yosemite carried something heavier. It wasn't just the gloom of the forest. It was the silence, thick and waiting, like the place itself was holding its breath. Trevor set his camera on a flat rock by the trail and launched the drone. Its blades hummed softly as it lifted, climbing above the treetops. On his screen, the old picnic area stretched out desolate, scattered with toppled benches and blackened fire pits. At one corner, the path toward the woods came into view, littered with fallen leaves and broken branches. He steered the drone lower, following the trail into a clearing at the heart of the forest to the well. The old stone well emerged in the frame, crumbling and moss-streaked. Trevor brought the drone closer, cautious adjusting the gimbal. Sunlight filtered through the pines, cutting a narrow beam down into the dark water below. His monitor flickered, catching something metallic just beneath the surface. He zoomed in, breath-catching. A bent handlebar, a warped wheel, faint red paint clinging to the frame like dried blood. A child's tricycle. Trevor froze, fingers rigid on the controls. Below the rear wheel, something else jutted out of the mud, pale and fragile, half buried in the muck. A small hand. Bone-thin fingers curled. For a long moment he couldn't hear anything but his own heartbeat thudding louder than the drone's buzz. He pulled off his headphones, throat-tight, breath uneven. His hand fumbled for his phone thumb, finding 911. The screen glowed against his face as the operator's voice crackled through. His eyes stayed locked on the image on his monitor, the tricycle, and the hand gleaming faintly in the shallow water. "I think," he whispered, his voice barely there. "I just found one of the kids." Then quieter still, almost afraid to say it aloud, "I think. There are more down there." The news spread quickly. By the next morning the parking lot was crowded with patrol cars, rescue trucks, and FBI evidence vans. Floodlights bathed the clearing in harsh, white-blue glare, throwing long shadows of the pine trees onto the ground. A yellow perimeter tape cut across the clearing, like a line between two worlds, the living and the 5 children who had vanished here in 1989. Martha Anderson stood just outside the tape, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, chin trembling. In more than 3 decades, she had never come back here. Every year they held a small memorial in Fresno where she moved after it happened. But Yosemite, no one had ever returned. No one wanted to. And yet here she was. Her eyes were hollow but steady. Her hair, now almost entirely white, was tied back neatly. Dew speckled her gray coat, and in her hands she clutched a faded photo of Megan, her daughter, smiling brightly, unaware this place would become her last known moment alive. The generators roared behind her, belching faint diesel fumes into the damp morning air. Technicians in hazmat suits worked slowly, lowering ropes and pulleys down into the well. A portable monitor, set up at the edge of the tape, displayed the grainy image from below the red tricycle, twisted and half sunk into last night's rain-soaked mud. Beside it, the small, pale hand had surfaced, even more fingers curled the mud around it, dark like dried blood. Martha didn't blink. She stared at the screen, her lips pressed into a bloodless line. She'd imagined this moment thousands of times in her dreams, but she hadn't expected it to feel so cold. Daniel stood silently next to her, motionless, his eyes red but dry. He hadn't cried in 20 years. Inside the clearing, the forensic team moved carefully, lifting the first buckets of muck and debris, layer by layer, as though afraid to damage what lay beneath. The mud dripped heavily into the sifting trays, revealing nothing at first but leaves, stones, scraps of rusted cans. Then one of the techs paused, holding up a scrap of pink fabric still caked in mud. A tiny shoe emerged, next rubber sole, worn, its thin lace frayed, dangling limp. Martha's breath caught. Her fingers crushed the photo in her hand as she leaned forward, heart pounding. She knew that shoe. It was Megan's. In that instant, it felt as though the entire forest held its breath. Decades of silence and denial seemed to press in from all sides, heavy as the earth at the bottom of that well. Her eyes never left the monitor. There would be no turning back now. And in her bones, she knew this was only the beginning. White-blue floodlights poured into the mouth of the well, catching dust and mist hanging in the air. Forensic technicians in full white suits crouched, low-gloved hands, working methodically to scrape away layers of heavy mud. The winch creaked with each load as buckets of earth rose from the depths and dumped onto tarps stretched across the ground, the mud splattering in dark, wet streaks mixed with shards of wood and rusted metal. Martha stood motionless, her eyes fixed on each bucket that surfaced. Between the roar of generators and the clatter of the winch, the only other sound was the steady, muted thud of mud hitting plastic, rhythmically like a heartbeat. A quiet murmur rippled through the line when a technician lifted out a longer strip of fabric, torn at the edges, pale pink smeared with mud. A headlamp beam swept over it, revealing faint remnants of a child's printed pattern barely visible through the grime. Moments later, another tiny shoe emerged, the same style, the same worn rubber sole, its lace dangling limply. No one spoke. They just kept working, lights flashing over the dark earth. Near noon, a different sound interrupted the metallic scrape of something heavy. A long, bent metal rod came up thick with sludge, but at its end was something heavier, wrapped tightly in silver cloth. The crew signaled for the winch to slow as they guided it gently to the ground. On the tarp, the shape became clearer, a small bundled form, no bigger than a child. Mud leaked from the tears in the fabric, filling the air with the raw smell of damp earth. Martha's breath caught her fingers, crushing the photo in her hands as she stared, her knuckles white. The forensic team unsealed the cloth carefully. Inside lay delicate pale bones, stacked neatly, a few pieces still clinging to faded pink cotton. Around one wrist, a ribbon frayed faded, tied in a crude little bow. The camera shutter clicked one frame at a time, harsh and dry. Martha turned her head, but didn't walk away. She stood just behind the line of tape, back straight, her hollow eyes still locked on the well. In her mind, fragments overlapped Megan's laughter, her blonde hair flying in the sunlight, pink shoes skipping across the grass, and then the silence that followed the trees. Now that same silence hung in the air. Below, the team kept digging layer after layer, their movements even more deliberate now. The well seemed endless, and the chill that rose from it grew sharper with each foot deeper they went. Every time a bucket came up low, whispers rippled around the clearing. Someone muttered almost to themselves, "They're not just going to find one." But no one answered. They just kept digging, and the darkness at the bottom of the well waited quietly, as if ready to swallow more. By late afternoon, Yosemite was washed in a silvery light, the granite peaks shrouded in mist. Around the clearing, the well site had become a maze of yellow tape floodlights, parked trucks, and slow-moving figures. The air hung heavy, with the smell of damp earth, diesel fumes, and faint disinfectant. Inside the makeshift command tent, harsh fluorescent light fell over a table strewn with folders and photographs. A sketched map of the area lay at the center, surrounded by images of each bone, each shoe, each ribbon unearthed so far. Among them was a worn, faded personnel file, stamped Yosemite National Park Service, 1989. Detective Amanda Carter of the FBI stood silently over the file. Small but steely, she had worked dozens of missing child cases, but this one, the way the children simply vanished without a trace, the way the earth kept giving up secrets 3 decades later, unsettled her more than most. She flipped to the first page. A name caught her eye: Eugene Harlan. In 1989, Eugene was a park ranger assigned to Curry Village. Notes indicated he often helped families set up camp, chatted with children, sometimes even watched over them while parents cooked dinner. No one thought anything of it. But in 1990, he abruptly quit, moved out of California, and vanished from official records. Carter's fingers lingered on an old black-and-white photo, Eugene in ranger uniform, leaning on a jeep, wearing a thin, uneasy smile. His mouth curved politely, but his eyes were darker than the grin let on. She set the photo aside, pulling a 1993 civil investigation report. Eugene had been stopped by police in Arkansas for loitering near a playground, but there wasn't enough evidence to hold him. After that, he vanished again. No address, no tax records, as if he'd simply dissolved. Carter stepped outside, standing at the edge of the clearing. Twilight crept in the clouds above, drifting in long gray bands. Floodlights still bathed the well, highlighting the silhouettes of technicians bent over, working deep into the night. She leaned against the fence, staring into the darkness below, as though she could already see Eugene down there waiting. Across the clearing, Martha stood, her silver hair shifting faintly in the cold wind. She no longer watched the camera screens, but kept her gaze fixed firmly on the well. Daniel stood behind her, silent. They didn't need to hear what Carter was learning. Parents could feel it, that what was about to come out of that well would hurt more than just bones and mud. A forensic tech approached Carter, laying a sealed evidence bag gently on the table, a new find. Inside was a small, rusted name tag. Carter turned it over under the light. The engraving was faint, but still legible, Harlan E. That night, Yosemite grew eerily quiet. The floodlights continued to rake over the earth, revealing more and more of 1989 layer by painful layer. And Eugene Harlan's name began to ride the wind through the clearing, clinging to the night like a ghost. That night, a thick fog rolled through Yosemite, muting the harsh yellow floodlights around the clearing into a dull haze. The excavation at the well had paused, but the investigation did not sleep. Inside the command tent, the map of the area had been expanded, new red lines sketched across it like a web reaching all the way to the northern rim of the canyon. Amanda Carter stood before the map, her eyes fixed. Buried in Eugene Harlan's file was a detail long overlooked. His last known address wasn't an apartment in Fresno, as first reported. It was a small parcel leased from the Forest Service just a few miles from Yosemite, where he'd built a so-called equipment shed during his ranger days. Carter tapped her finger on the map on the lone black mark deep in the trees that now stood for his cabin. Near midnight, a convoy of FBI and SWAT vehicles pulled away from the clearing tires, crunching over damp dirt as they wound up a narrow forest road. Headlights swept through the darkness, catching towering pines like silent sentinels watching from above. Wind hissed through the brittle branches, mingling with the faint crackle of radio chatter in the cars. The cabin appeared after a sharp turn, half hidden behind overgrown brush. Its dark wooden roof was streaked with old rain stains, the front door hanging slightly ajar. Windows sealed behind drawn curtains. A pile of rotting firewood slumped against the porch. No lights, no sound. Carter stepped out of the vehicle, her grip firm on her flashlight. The wooden door opened with a shrill creak, releasing a wave of damp, moldy air. Her beam swept across the first room, a rough wooden table scarred with knife marks, a folded and yellowed map nailed to the wall, a few empty hooks jutting from the paneling. Cardboard boxes stacked in the corner sagged with moisture fabric scraps, scattered across the floorboards. One by one, the forensic team filed in cameras, snapping quietly. In a shadowed corner, Carter crouched down, lifting a loose floorboard to reveal a trapdoor. Beneath it, a short wooden staircase descended into a cramped cellar. The air below was heavy thick with the faint sting of bleach and rust. Flashlight beams caught on things that made the team go still, rows of metal racks, lined with tiny children's clothes, shoes arranged neatly in pairs. A small broken chair lay on its side in the corner, and beneath it, a faded Polaroid photo lay in the dust. Carter picked it up, brushing off the film. Under the harsh light, the image came into focus, 5 children seated on wooden steps, their faces streaked with dirt eyes, wide with fear. In the corner of the photo, scrawled in a shaky hand, were the words, "Day 2." No one said a word. Only the steady flashes of the forensic cameras echoed in the cellar. And in that moment, Carter knew what they'd dug from the well was just the surface. This cellar was the doorway into the darkest part of the nightmare. The cellar still reeked of bleach and dust as the forensic team cleared each corner. Flashlights strobed across the walls, evidence bags lined the wooden steps, sealed and tagged one by one. Amanda Carter stood quietly in the corner, studying the far wall behind the metal racks. The wood paneling there had a faint gap, the nails newer than those in the rest of the room. She tapped it lightly. It rang hollow. Carter signaled to a technician, and with a few careful pries, the loose board came free, revealing a narrow, dark recess. Inside, buried under grime, was an old tin box. Carter crouched gloved hands, pulling it out gently. The lid slid open easily, revealing a small, brown, cloth-bound notebook, its edges frayed faint, embossed flowers, barely visible on the cover. She opened it to the first page, and the smell of damp paper rose like a ghost. Childish handwriting. Scrawled across the inside cover was a single, faded word, Megan. The first entries were hurried, crooked day 1. "They took us down here. It's too dark." Emily cries. Jason won't say anything. I hold Chloe. I won't cry. I can't. Carter turned the next page, her hand tightening. Each day marked counted day 2, day 4, day 7. The writing grew weaker, slanted, but still forced itself onto the page day 7. Tyler won't wake up anymore. I touched his hand, cold. Emily asked where he went. I didn't know what to say. A torn page fluttered loose, jagged along the edge. In shaky, trembling letters, it read, Day 12. He told me not to scream. He said if I stayed quiet, I'd get to leave. I don't believe him, but I want to go. Carter exhaled, slowly, turning toward the back. The entries thinned, until one near the end simply read, I got out. Her eyes narrowed as she turned to the very last page. Scrawled hastily, in what looked like red ink, crooked and uneven, was one final message. If someone reads this, I didn't die. Don't believe him. I'm still out there. The cellar fell silent. The team stood frozen for a moment. Carter closed the notebook, sliding it into a sealed bag, her eyes as dark as the forest outside. Maybe Megan really had escaped. Maybe she was still out there somewhere under a different name, a different life, still carrying the memory of these nights in the cellar. And if she was alive, this story was far from over. That night, the cellar was sealed, the harsh, white-yellow lights blinking out one by one as the investigation team withdrew from the cabin. Amanda Carter sat in her car, Megan's notebook resting on her lap. Every word haunted her, especially those final lines, I didn't die. I'm still out there. In the temporary field office back in Yosemite, Carter stayed up through the night flipping through stacks of old and new records, combing databases of foster care intakes, orphanage files, and unidentified missing persons reports, spanning from 1989 to 2000. If Megan had escaped, she must have left some kind of trace somewhere. Around 3 a.m., on the cold glow of her monitor, a faded intake report from the Fresno Shelter for Girls. 1991 caught her eye. The record listed a girl called Sadie Clark, roughly 12 or 13, blonde hair, blue eyes, thin, found wandering near Interstate 5. She didn't speak much, gave only the name. Sadie claimed not to remember her parents or her school. Stayed at the shelter for a few months before vanishing one night without a trace. Carter zoomed in on the blurry black and white photo attached to the file. The quality was poor, but the eyes pale, frightened. But with that same hard glint of quiet defiance, she knew them. They were the same eyes from the Polaroid in the cellar. The name Sadie Clark didn't match any birth certificates. It didn't match any death records either. She'd simply slipped away, leaving only a false name behind. By sunrise, Carter drove straight to Fresno, stopping at the Clearview Shelter, formerly Fresno Shelter for Girls. The current administrator had long since changed, but in the dusty backroom archive, she unearthed an old intake ledger. The final page confirmed it. Sadie Clark, admitted June 1991, disappeared. September 1991. And beneath that, scrawled in faint red ink, as though left deliberately for whoever might come looking someday. Don't come looking. It's not safe. Carter stood in the cramped records room, her fingertips brushing over the words, a chill running down her spine. It felt as if Megan or Sadie had known someone would come eventually. Driving back through the valley, Carter didn't stop. In her mind, the blurry image of Sadie Clark kept spinning, refusing to fade. If she was alive, if she was still hiding out there, then who or what had forced her to run so far and stay hidden for so long? A sharp Sierra wind slipped through the cracked window of the car, cold against her cheek, a quiet reminder that this hunt was only just beginning. And somewhere out there, Megan's shadow still waited, watching. Back at Yosemite, the days that followed felt heavier than ever. The well had been sealed with a tarp and crime tape, the clearing left with only a handful of guards. Floodlights casting long scars of mud and dirt across the churned earth like old wounds. Amanda Carter stood at the edge of the tape, holding the Polaroid found in the cellar. In the photo, 5 children huddled together, eyes hollow with fear. But looking closer, she saw Megan or Sadie at the edge, her dirty face lit just enough to reveal eyes that were somehow brighter than the others. That night, stopping at a faded roadside photo shop in Fresno, Carter asked about records. The old man behind the counter listened and then pulled a dusty yellow envelope from a drawer, sliding it across the counter. On the outside, written in faint pencil, was just one name, Sadie Clark. Inside was a single photograph, the playground of Clearview Shelter in 1991. Among the other girls, Sadie stood leaning against a fence, hands in her pockets, staring directly into the camera. Her eyes carried something unsettling, calm, cold, almost a warning. On the back of the photograph, scrawled in sharp red ink, was a short message. "Stop digging, or it'll find you too." Carter looked up at the pale Fresno sky, a sharp wind picking up dust along the road. She slipped the photo back into her pocket, her expression darkening. She knew now this case would never really be over, at least not for her. In Yosemite, Martha Anderson still returned to the well every morning, sitting on a weathered bench, hands folded in her lap, staring into nothing. She didn't cry anymore. She just watched, as though still believing that someday Megan would emerge from the deep woods, even if only to say goodbye. In the cellar beneath the cabin, in the smell of rot and dust, a faint scrawl remained etched into the back wall, barely visible unless you shined a light just right. "I made sure no one else ends up here." Amanda Carter came back to Yosemite one last time, standing before the well. The mud below was dry now, still and quiet. But in the icy wind sweeping through the clearing that night, she could swear she heard a girl's whisper carried on the breeze. "Still out here? Still watching?" Carter closed her eyes, lowered her head, and whispered back, "I know." Then she turned and walked away, leaving the well behind, swallowed by the darkness of Yosemite.